Warning: the following content may contain elements that are not suitable for some audiences. Accordingly, viewer discretion is advised. Between 1978 and 1990, a man murdered at least 52 women and children across the Soviet Union. He was arrested and released multiple times. An innocent man was convicted of his very first murder, arrested, tried, and executed, while the real killer walked free and killed again and again. In 1984, police had Chikatilo in custody. They tested his blood. The type didn't match the semen samples from crime scenes. They let him go. They didn't know yet that some people secrete different blood types in different bodily fluids. Chikatilo was one of them. A biological anomaly so rare that Soviet forensic science simply hadn't encountered it. He killed 22 more people after that. And overseeing all of it, a political system that insisted, at an ideological level, that serial killers could not exist in a communist society. That such depravity was a product of capitalism. That to admit a monster was loose in the Soviet Union was to admit a failure the state could not afford. His name was Andrei Chikatilo. He was known as the Butcher of Rostov. The Red Ripper. The Rostov Ripper. He was one of the most prolific and savage serial killers of the 20th century. And the Soviet Union handed him 12 years. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in Yabloknoy, a small village in the Ukrainian SSR, at one of the darkest moments in Soviet history. The Great Ukrainian Famine of the early 1930s had killed millions. Starvation was so extreme in some regions that reports of cannibalism circulated, neighbors consuming neighbors, families consuming the dead to survive. Chikatilo grew up in the shadow of this. His mother told him repeatedly throughout his childhood that he had an older brother, Stefan, who had been kidnapped and eaten by starving neighbors before Andrei was born. Whether this story was true has never been verified. But Chikatilo believed it. And he carried it with him for the rest of his life. His childhood was defined by hunger, poverty, and humiliation. He was a chronic bedwetter, mocked and beaten by his mother for it. He suffered from hydrocephalus, fluid around the brain, which caused him to be clumsy, poorly coordinated, and an easy target for other children. He was academically intelligent, but his university application was rejected. A humiliation he never fully processed. He served in the Soviet army. Then trained as a teacher through correspondence courses. Then began working in schools across the Rostov region. As a teacher, he was reported multiple times for inappropriate touching of students. Groping. Exposing himself. Each time. He was quietly disciplined and allowed to move to a different school. Nobody escalated. Nobody filed charges. The Soviet system absorbed the complaints and moved on. During this period, Chikatilo was discovering something about himself. Conventional sexual contact left him impotent and humiliated. But the fear and suffering of others, that was different. In 1978, he stopped teaching and became a factory purchasing clerk, a job that required him to travel constantly across the Soviet Union. It gave him access to railway stations and bus stops across dozens of cities. And it gave him victims. On December 22, 1978, Chikatilo lured a 9-year-old girl named Lena Zakotnova away from a bus stop in Shakhty. He took her to a small shed he had rented near the river. He attempted to rape her. When she struggled and screamed, he stabbed her and threw her body into the Grashevka River. His method was established from that very first murder. Railway stations. Bus stops. Train platforms. He would approach vulnerable targets. Runaways, children traveling alone, young women, homeless individuals, and offer them something. Food. Cigarettes. A place to stay. A promise of work. Then he would lead them into the forest. What he did in those forests is among the most disturbing material in the documented history of serial crime. He stabbed his victims dozens of times. He mutilated them. He gouged out their eyes. Believing, he would later claim, that a dying person's retinas held an imprint of the last thing they saw, and he didn't want to leave his image behind. He removed organs. He bit off body parts. He achieved sexual release not through intercourse but through the act of killing itself. His victims were predominantly children and teenagers, boys and girls. Some were as young as 7 years old. He would later confess to 56 murders. 52 were confirmed and proven at trial. Each one was hidden under a thin covering of leaves and dirt near the forest floor. Each one was eventually found. And for 12 years, nobody found him. To understand how Chikatilo killed for 12 years, you have to understand the system he was operating inside. The Soviet Union had an ideological problem with what Chikatilo was. Serial killers, according to official Soviet doctrine, were a product of capitalist decadence. They were a symptom of the moral decay of Western society, not something that could exist under socialism. To acknowledge a serial killer operating freely in the USSR was to acknowledge that the Soviet system had produced a monster. That was politically unacceptable. So in the early years of the investigation, cases were treated in isolation. Different murders in different cities were not linked. Local police handled local cases, and were deeply reluctant to escalate anything that might draw attention to a problem the state said couldn't exist. When investigators did eventually form a centralized task force, they were working with paper files, limited forensic technology, and a political environment that punished failure and discouraged uncomfortable truths. The most catastrophic consequence of this came in 1978, immediately after Chikatilo's very first murder. A local man named Alexander Kravchenko was arrested for the killing of Lena Zakotnova. He had a prior conviction for rape. Under the interrogation methods routinely used by Soviet police, methods that prioritized confession over evidence, Kravchenko confessed. He was convicted. He was sentenced to death. In 1984, Alexander Kravchenko was executed. Andrei Chikatilo had been killing continuously since 1978. He killed 7 people in 1982 alone. By the time Kravchenko was executed for his very first murder, Chikatilo had killed dozens more people. An innocent man died. The real killer attended his factory job, boarded trains, and hunted at bus stops. By 1984, investigators had formed a dedicated task force and were conducting mass surveillance operations at railway and bus stations across the Rostov region. On September 14, 1984, Chikatilo was detained at a bus station after officers observed him approaching women and behaving suspiciously. Police had semen samples from crime scenes. Those samples indicated blood type AB. Chikatilo was tested. His blood type came back as A. They didn't match. Chikatilo was released. What Soviet forensic science did not yet fully understand was a phenomenon called non-secretion, a rare biological anomaly in which an individual's blood type as expressed in their saliva and semen can differ from their blood type. Chikatilo was one of a very small number of people in whom this discrepancy exists. The science was known in Western forensic literature. It had not reached the investigators in Rostov. He was released on October 14, 1984. He murdered 22 more people before he was finally caught. 22 people. Because of a biological anomaly that a different forensic framework might have caught. By the late 1980s, the investigation had been running for nearly a decade with no arrest. Public fear was growing. Media pressure, newly freed by Gorbachev's glasnost reforms, was intensifying. In desperation, investigators turned to something that had never been used in Soviet criminal investigation before. Psychological profiling. A psychiatrist named Dr. Alexander Buchanovsky was brought in. He studied the crime scenes, the victim profiles, the patterns of mutilation, and produced a written psychological portrait of the killer, describing him as a sexually inadequate male in his late 30s or 40s, likely educated, likely employed in a job requiring travel, almost certainly married with children. It was an accurate description of Andrei Chikatilo in almost every particular. But without a name, a profile is only a direction, not an answer. The answer came through old-fashioned surveillance. By late 1990, officers were stationed at transport hubs across the region. On November 6, 1990, Chikatilo killed his final victim, a 22-year-old woman named Sveta Karostik, in a forest near Donlaskaz station. When he emerged from the woods shortly afterward, there was blood on his face. An officer noted his details but let him go. When investigators cross-referenced the officer's report against their suspect list, Chikatilo's name was already there. He had been on their radar for years. On November 20th, 1990, he was placed under surveillance. 6 days later, he was arrested. In custody, Chikatilo initially denied everything. Then Dr. Buchanovsky, the psychiatrist who had profiled him years earlier, was brought into the interrogation room. Not as an investigator, but as someone who wanted to understand him. Who was interested in him. Who treated him as a subject worth studying. Chikatilo responded to that attention the way he had always responded to being seen. He opened up. Over several days he confessed in extraordinary detail. Not to 36 murders, which was all police had linked to him, but to 56. He led investigators to body sites they hadn't found. He described crimes in detail that only the killer could know. His trial began in April 1992. He was held in a metal cage in the courtroom, ostensibly for security, but the image it produced was unforgettable. A man in a cage, surrounded by the families of his victims, at turns shouting, singing, rambling incoherently, and dropping his trousers. Whether it was genuine instability or calculated performance, nobody could say for certain. In October 1992, Andrei Chikatilo was convicted of 52 murders and sentenced to death for each. On February 14, 1994, Valentine's Day, he was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head in a Moscow prison. He was 57 years old. 52 confirmed victims. The youngest just 7 years old. 12 years. Dozens of cities. Hundreds of investigators. And a system that, at every critical junction, either looked away, got it wrong, or executed the wrong man. Alexander Kravchenko was innocent. He died for a crime Chikatilo committed, put to death by a justice system so determined to close a case, so resistant to uncertainty, that it killed a man rather than admit it didn't have the answer. The Chikatilo case changed Soviet and then Russian forensic science permanently. It introduced psychological profiling to a system that had never used it. It exposed the catastrophic consequences of an ideology that insisted certain crimes couldn't exist, and then had no framework for dealing with them when they did. But those changes came after 52 people were dead. After an innocent man was executed. After 12 years of a monster boarding trains and hunting at bus stops while the state argued about whether he was even possible. Subscribe if this case stayed with you. And leave a comment. Of all the systemic failures in this case, which one do you think cost the most lives? I hope you enjoyed the video and I'll see you in the next one.